Well, it's kind of interesting. I have this place here in my home office where I can come and record at any time, but I just haven't so much lately because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. If I back up 3 years or maybe 5 years ago, I was in this office quite a bit because of all the craziness that was happening in the world through government shutdowns and all the stuff with COVID. But as we revived out of the coma of COVID, I haven't spent as much time in this office. So I kind of forget to sit down and record, and then it seems like too much work. So I don't know, maybe this morning you wouldn't mind if I just kind of ramble as I drink my coffee. We are certainly living in some pretty interesting times, and watching all the things that are going on in the world, it feels like as a pastor that I need to speak about these things. And sometimes I have to remind myself that I don't really need to speak about things. I can if I'd like to. And I mean, I do every single week when I speak to the church that gathers at Cross Connection, that when we gather together, I got lots of different things to say. But then throughout the week, it's like, well, I don't really know if I have a ton to say beyond the things that I said on Sunday. But in reality, I do, because there are a lot of things going on that I kind of have a position to speak into, especially when you look at the things that are happening in our own nation as it relates to Christianity. We're seeing not only division in our nation between groups politically, and the self-selection of people moving to places where they feel more politically comfortable. In fact, I kind of talked a little bit about that in a message that I gave this last week at the church. So I've watched, being here in Southern California, as people have moved to different areas to draw closer to people who think more like they do, or I should say maybe don't even think more like they do, but who vote more like they do. So they have a similar political leaning. A lot of the people I know closely who've moved to those places, they realize that, well, the people in these areas, they don't actually think in the same way that I do. We just align on some political things. Regardless, the division that we're seeing in our country politically has definitely moved into the church world as well. And this isn't new. I mean, if you look back to the early 20th century, you certainly see a division happening within Protestant Christianity. And that's really what I'm speaking about, is a separation, a tear that's happening in the middle of Protestant Christianity in America. That happened in the early 20th century as well. You had this great fight between, like Fosdick and Machen as it relates to liberalism and, fundamentalism within the church. And the liberals, they kind of won the day in the mainline denominations and in a lot of the big seminaries. And so the fundamentalists, as they withdrew, they had to go and start their own new institutions and their own new Bible colleges, seminaries, church planting movements, organizations, networks, if you will. And so you had all kinds of different things that grew out of this. And so that happened in the middle 20th century in a big way. And it grew into, especially for those who are more aligned with a traditional Protestantism when it comes to biblical orthodoxy and Christianity, the fundamentalists, they grew into this new movement of evangelicals, which today in 2025, the word evangelical is used pejoratively by people who are not in the church. Kind of secular society speaks of the evangelicals as if they're some big political boogeyman. And there's, some reasons why that happens. But even within the church, Protestant Christians kind of have to use the term evangelical with like disclaimers that they're not this kind of evangelical. It's almost like they have to put scare quotes around evangelical. So evangelicalism, that was kind of the outgrowth of fundamentalist, movements and the tear that happened between liberals and fundamentalists. Evangelicalism is going through something of a tearing again. I mean, a lot of the institutions, one of the major institutions that was started by one of the godfathers of the evangelical movement was Fuller Theological Seminary. And then of course, over time, Fuller Theological Seminary has also kind of drifted into left-leaning areas. So today, you would certainly have people who are more conservative, fundamentalist evangelicals who lean in that direction for like a strong orthodoxy, who would point at Fuller and the people who come out of Fuller and say, well, they're woke. That's the big term to use today, woke or progressive, in place of, formerly liberals. So we're seeing a tearing happen again within the church. And the challenge is that I find myself, especially as a pastor serving in Southern California, where, this has been a blue state for a pretty large chunk of my life, especially in my adult life. So in this environment, you have a mix of people who have different worldviews and political leanings. So as a result of this county would be kind of purple in the sense, and much more blue for anybody who lives in a dark red state. So living here, I've always felt like I'm in between two worlds. But now within the church, I find myself in between two worlds. And I see people who are, say, to my conservative side of Christianity, who I agree with on so many points of doctrinal positions within the scriptures. I find that I align with them on those things, but there is a fast move further and further in the direction towards things that I don't align with or that I have concerns about. And the interesting thing is that some of those concerns, when I hear the people articulate their view, there's a lot of things that they say that I go, okay, I agree with that, I agree with that, I agree with that. But there's these little bits in between the lines, if you will, that you're like, I'm not sure that we're saying the same thing on this point, and it seems like you're alluding to something that I totally don't agree with. So I find myself concerned as I see the drift in that direction. But then on the other side, you have people who, there are certain social agendas or views that they have that I go, I can see and understand what it is that they're saying, and they have concerns. They have concerns, as did Carl Henry, who, was the godfather or one of the godfathers of the evangelical movement and one of the, starting faculty, founding members of Fuller Theological Seminary. He had concerns, if you back up 80 years ago almost, to concerns about capitalism, that there were issues that were not being discussed. He was totally against communism, as many people in the post-war era of the late 1940s, early 1950s were. So he was totally against that. And I would find myself, totally against that as well. And even socialism, I have deep concerns about that. So I definitely find myself aligning with capitalism. But anybody who's grown up in my generation and grew up through 2008 and 2009, or even the lead up to that, of the economic disparities that were happening and just the huge, rise of costs, especially for housing in, say, like 2005, 6, and 7, when I got married during that time, and my wife and I were trying to figure out how to start our lives. And so we were wrestling with those issues. And so if you look at everything that happened early 2000s until about 2010, with the economy being on fire and then the economy collapsing and being on fire, 2008, 2009, and all the things that were coming with that, there are valid critiques that people are making about, hey, there are concerns that we have of what I would call an unethical capitalism. I think capitalism has a lot of incredibly good values and strengths, but if it doesn't have an objective morality that governs it, then there are ways to game the system such that economic disparities are the ultimate outcome. So if there are Christians who are saying, hey, this is a concern, they're instantly labeled by people who are right of them as, well, you must be a socialist or a communist. It's like, well, hold on, not so fast. And so there's issues like that I find myself, I agree with some of the concerns that come from people who would be more to the left of me. And when I say left of me, I don't just mean politically, I mean theologically. But in a move to the left, progressive Christianity abandons a lot of the orthodox values that I would hold to. And so I say, well, I definitely can't align with you. I still see a binary between male and female, and I see that God created men and women in his image distinctly and purposefully. So I have issues when you get into the T of LGBTQ issues. And then I think that marriage was instituted by God. God made them male and female and said that a man should leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is, the earliest areas of orthodoxy in the scripture. So I hold to these things, and I recognize that these are important values, or issues of pro-life, or all those sorts of things. But the objections that people may have on the left to issues within, economics or global world engagement and militarism, those are things that we certainly should examine in light of the scriptures. And I think that's the core thing that I've been working really hard to do, is to examine things in light of the scriptures. What do the scriptures say? And to really wrestle with those things, even if they come against my natural proclivities, which is exactly what I've been seeing as I've been teaching through the book of Luke. The last 3 weeks, we went through Luke chapter 6, which is the Sermon on the Mount. And a big core of what Luke focuses on in Jesus's kingdom message has to do with loving your enemy and not judging. And these are the passages. Luke 6, when Jesus says, love your enemy and judge not that you be not judged. These are like the favorite texts of people who are not Christians, who are not really Bible readers. And these are the texts that people point to when they say, well, I like Jesus. He was a good moral teacher. And of course, I think Jesus was a good moral teacher, but he's far more than that as a Christian as I am. I know that to be the case. So there is this leaning towards these views of love your enemy and judge not that you be not judged. And there's a lot of context there, and you can go listen to my messages on the church's YouTube channel to see what I have to say about those things. But in those things, I'm confronted because I find in myself a nationalistic leaning towards a fighting patriotism. I mean, I was born and raised in America, and post-war America in the second half of the 20th century and coming into the 21st century, as it came into the 21st century, is a very patriotic, nationalistic environment. But a lot of things that happened after the turn of the century into the 21st century and the rise of radical Islam, the terror attacks in 9/11, America's response to those terror attacks, and you can have a lot of opinions on the rightness or wrongness of the response to those things. There's probably a mix of both right and wrong things that led to the response of that. But the rise of all that and everything that happened, my generation and those younger than me obviously wrestle with these issues having to do with military engagement in the rest of the world and what that means for economic disparities here. So these are concerns that I understand the concerns, and we Christians need to be able to speak to these concerns clearly and to articulate a valid response that's more in line with the scriptures than just is in line with our political ideologies. And those political ideologies, whether you're on the left or you're on the right, are being pulled to the further poles of those positions. And we can see that in clear ways that both groups get to a point where they start to speak in very negative and dangerous terms against other groups. And it falls into, as I've been saying, as I've been going through Luke, into a love your neighbor and hate your enemy kind of mindset. And these things are not going to lead to the continued unification of our culture or of our nation. And so I find myself in this strange place in the middle, trying to look at my own proclivities towards nationalism, patriotism, towards self-defense, and all those sorts of things. And then I have to weigh those against this call of Christ to love your enemies. And that's always pulling me back towards the center, back towards a Christian theology, an applied theology. And I'm really wrestling with these things. And I think it's a good thing for Christians to wrestle with. And I think we should be very concerned by some of the things that are happening in the Christian community, pulling people either to the right, to extremes, or to the left, the extremes. I have problems with progressive Christianity. There are doctrinal errors in progressive Christianity, but some of their views about social ills or problems in the world are valid. But I also have problems with the move towards an isolationist Christian nationalism and some real issues there socially. I agree with a lot of the doctrinal positions of people on that side, and I can nod my head in agreement to a lot of different things that they might say, but there is a pull that moves in both directions on the right and the left towards a love your neighbor and hate your enemy sort of worldview. And so we have to make sure that as Christians, we fight back against that. Christ, or the whole of the scriptures, when you look at the whole counsel of God, the whole counsel of God does teach, personally, live at peace with all people and turn the other cheek when someone insults you or slaps you, or give to those who ask without expecting anything in return, or these non-violent sort of moves towards loving your enemy. Those are all in the scriptures. At the same time, the whole counsel of God teaches us not only how to respond to power when you have none, that would be the turn the other cheek sort of mindset, but also how to use power rightly when you do have it. And unfortunately, in at least the context that I live in, looking at the last 50 or so years of American Christian history, the American Protestant church has not really handled power well when it's had it, and to use it in a way that honors God rightly. So we really need to be challenged by that reality. That said, I think that God, he spoke judgment against the children of Israel, like in the time of Isaiah, because they did not defend the cause of the fatherless, the widow, and the stranger in their midst, the foreigners. So these three minority groups were not defended. They were disadvantaged and oftentimes taken advantage of, and God said, I'm going to judge you for that. So if you have power, you need to use power in the right way to defend those who are defenseless, and to make sure that you never use power in an unrighteous way that is only for your own retribution or vengeance or whatever it may be. So these are the things that I'm wrestling with, and I don't know, maybe something for you to think about as you are examining the scriptures or just examining the world around you. This is where the biblical theology becomes an applied theology. How does it work out in our lives? And it starts first with me, that I have to challenge myself to make sure that I am exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. These 9 things and others, they need to be the hallmarks of my life as a Christian. And I need to, as Peter says, endeavor to add to my faith these virtues. And there are practical ways that we can do that as we go through the scriptures. But that is the call that God calls us to. Something to think about. I hope that you'll think about it as maybe you're drinking your coffee or reading the scriptures. Hopefully you will read the scriptures this week, and hopefully I'll have some more to say about that in the future. See you next time.